स्टार्ट के तो Good evening and welcome to Day 2 of Edition X, Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. Last year, we were introduced to a new world, and while we negotiate our way through new ways of belonging in this new world, a lot of us have found comfort in the old. And Gerald Durrell's world definitely is one that many have revisited, particularly in the last year. Our first session today, fittingly, is Durrell's Magic, where Lee Durrell discusses Gerald Durrell's Corfu Trilogy with Sandip Roy. Quick introductions. Sandip Roy is a novelist and journalist whose first novel was listed for prestigious awards such as the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and the Green Carnation Prize. He's a contributing editor for Huffington Post in India and a longtime radio commentator for National Public Radio in the US. Sandip is also a Kolkata Lit Meet regular. Lee McGeorge Durrell is an American naturalist, author, zookeeper, and television presenter. She's best known for her work at the Jersey Zoological Park in the British Channel island of Jersey with her late husband, Gerald Durrell, and for co-authoring books with him. She has studied animal behavior, and her doctorate is on the calls of mammals and birds in Madagascar. She accompanied Durrell on his last 3 conservation missions and became the honorary director of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. She's a member, of various expert groups on conservation and is fondly called Mother Tortoise in certain areas of Madagascar due to her work with the plowshare tortoise. Over to you, Sandip.
Yeah, and Lee Durrell, welcome to the Kolkata Literary Meet. We're delighted to have you here. I put on my animal tiger shirt. I don't know if you can see it in honor of this.
Looks great. Thank you, Sandip.
I'm sorry that you can't be here in person because of the pandemic, but there is something magical that we're able to reach you in Corfu, the place which we, even those of us who've never been there, feel so intimately familiar with because of my family and other animals. So tell us, what can you see out of your window if you look right now? It's probably in the middle of the day for you.
Out of my window, I will try to show you. It's very windy today, but let me take the screen over and have a quick look this way. Can you see?
Wow, blue sky. Are those olive and myrtle trees?
There's olive and cypress trees, and that's our very, very own mountain. I think I'll close the window now.
Yeah.
No, we, my partner Colin and I bought the house here 2.5 years ago, and it needed quite a bit doing on it. It was very old, and it hadn't been lived in for 20 years, and so we're still working on it.
That sounds like every single house that was in My Family and Other Animals. It just starts with the houses decaying gently into the hillside and the garden.
Looks like one of the houses. Maybe you'll have a glimpse of it later.
So how much of the Corfu of those books still remains?
Now, that's a very good and timely question, because I don't know if you know, Jerry revisited Corfu in the 1960s. So that was, 30 years later. And when he first came back, it was very much like he remembered it. But just a few years after that, sort of mass tourism started, and mass development in terms of tourists, so big hotels and things on the beautiful beaches and the cliffs, and pretty much most of the coastline of Corfu has been affected by some really not very attractive hotels. The infrastructure of the island, in a lot of ways, particularly rubbish collection, has been deeply affected. But if you go into the interior of the island, which is actually where my house is, you could be back 80 years ago. And so a lot has changed, but still some of it remains. And the Corfu are wonderful people. And I think, and feel so lucky to have ended up here.
Do you still get those stone bottles of cold ginger beer? In My Family and Other Animals, they kept having that all the time.
Ginger beer, they call it, ginger beer. Yes, that's a Corfu speciality. And you drink that in the summer. It's wonderful.
And so what do people, I know those books are such a beloved classic around the world. In fact, I just brought a copy of one of my Durrell books, Two in the Bush. But the reason I brought it, because even though it's falling apart, is to show you that, right, I don't know if you can see it, but right at the bottom, the glare is too much, but right at the bottom of this page, there is the signature of Gerald Durrell when he came to India. And it's probably my first autograph ever. So I was quite a fan at that time.
Very, very important, very important. Well, Jerry loved signing his books for people, because he was always very appreciative that people would buy his books and read them. So he certainly never refused to have a book signing. And anyway, I'm glad he signed yours, Sandip. That's something.
Lots of people. He came to our school, and a lot of my old schoolmates have been saying, like, "Oh my God, what a wonderful talk it was!" Because My Family and Other Animals was also one of our texts later. But I was curious, like, in Corfu, how are those books regarded? I mean, do you get a Durrell discount when you go around Corfu?
No. Probably things cost me more. I don't know. No, people now, I have to say, when I started coming to Corfu, I came first with Jerry, obviously, in the early 80s. We were doing a television series about the natural history of the island. And then I kept coming every few years after that. And even after he passed away, I would come and help and show people around the island, kind of in the footsteps of the Durrells. And so that was in the 90s and the early 2000s. And people didn't really seem to remember the Durrells that much until a good friend of mine persuaded the municipal government to name the municipal gardens after the Durrell brothers. It's now called Boschetto. Boschetto is a word for garden in Greek. So it's called the Boschetto Durrell. And there are two busts in the garden, one of Lawrence Durrell and one of Jerry, in beautiful bronze. They're lovely busts. And I like to go into that garden and see whose nose is the shiniest. People love to rub the noses of bronze statues for good luck. And so I'm glad to say Jerry's is the shiniest.
I can imagine. Actually, a school friend of mine just today, when he heard I was doing this, sent me a picture of those bronze busts, because he'd just been to Corfu a couple of years ago or something. And he said, "Oh, these are the bronze busts of the garden. And this is the church where Margot kissed the feet of the saint and caught the flu or caught some virus."
That's right. That's right. But it was from that time, and I think they were renamed. Actually, 15. This is the 15th anniversary of the naming of the garden after the Durrells. And after that time, that is when they're named after the Durrells. That's when people in Corfu really started to realize who the Durrells were and why the books. And I say the books. It's not just Jerry's book, but Lawrence wrote a lovely book about Corfu called Prospero's Cell, and those books are becoming better known. And the Greek translation of My Family and Other Animals really wasn't terribly good, but there was a beautiful translation done about 3 years ago. So I think that has also helped the popularity. Of course, now the television series, there was a TV series done in Britain.
I heard about that, though I haven't seen it. I don't think it showed in India.
Very popular. In Britain, obviously, in the US, some countries in Europe, and it has been shown in Greece. And anyway, everybody now knows about the Durrells because of that television series. The power of television, as we know.
Whatever works.
Yeah.
So what about the family? The trilogy ends with the World War II is approaching, and so they are returning back to England with all the animals and the magpies perched on top of the luggage. And but what happened to the family after that?
Well, after that, Jerry was about 15 years old, so he couldn't really join up to fight in the war. And when he was 17, I think he was assessed for the military service, but he always had terrible sinus problems. So he was not taken into the military, but he had to work on a farm, as people did during the war. And of course, he loved that, and that was just perfect for him. Lawrence was in the diplomatic corps in various countries around the world. Brother Leslie I think he went to Africa and tried to make a go of a fruit farm there, not successfully. And Margot, the sister, she stayed in Bournemouth and opened a boarding house. And lots of funny stories came out. She since wrote a book about that called Whatever Happened to Margot. And lots of funny stories there, as you can imagine, very, very Durrell-esque. Then after the war, Lawrence continued in his diplomatic role, but was really writing in earnest, and then became a full-time writer, and went to a village in the south of France, near Nîmes, right in the south of France, and moved into a little farm cottage there. And in fact, Jerry and I later bought that cottage. I'm way ahead now. That was in 1982. Jerry, though, himself, and you probably know this story from his later books, he began to collect animals for British zoos after the war, and went and had many adventures that he wrote about. In fact, his first book, a lot of people think his first book was My Family and Other Animals, about the Corfu period, but not at all. It was about his time in West Africa, collecting.
Was it the Daffodils?
No, the first was called The Overloaded Ark.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Overloaded Ark, and that was in Cameroon. And then his next expedition was to South America, and that was called Three Singles to Adventure, and it was about his collecting in Guyana. Then he went back to Africa, and Baffert Beagles was the third book. I think I'm getting a little. Jerry wrote 41 books.
Yeah, I think I've read about a dozen of them, including some novels. I remember Rosie's My Relative and Splits of Place. But in the beginning, I remember at the beginning of Birds, Beasts, and Relatives, he has this funny introduction where the family is all gathered in Bournemouth, and the Lawrence Durrell, is complaining that that Dickens-like caricature damaged my literary image. And, it's like, it's fine being caricatured, but being caricatured in bad prose, that's terrible. And I think Leslie or Margot is saying that bloody book of Jerry's took me ages to live that down. But in general, do you have any sense of how the family took to how they appeared in the books?
Yes, because I knew the only one I didn't know was well, two I didn't know was Leslie. Leslie passed away in 1983, but Jerry's mother died long before he and I met, and so. But I did know Margaret and Larry quite well, and to be honest, they were really quite amused by the way Jerry depicted them, and the best thing is that they were so happy that that his books were so popular. They really reveled in the fact of his success with those books. So far from the sort of rivalry and the bickering that you read about in the books, they were all really quite close and quite friendly with each other. So I think they didn't mind at all, really, the way he did.
Well, it is done with so much affection. I mean, that shines
Exactly.
through, whether it's for the family or for the scorpions or for the magpies or the dogs. He has equal affection for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the important thing about Jerry's books, is that he is his family and other animals. And he just sees the connection between human beings and all other life forms. And that's what's so brilliantly depicted in those books.
I'm going to come to the animals part of it, but since you brought up Lawrence Durrell and the fact that he wrote this book, Prospero's Cell, which was also about the time in Corfu, and for people who read it, they'll recognize a lot of characters like Theodore and Spyro are all in that book. But the intriguing thing I realized is that Lawrence Durrell had a wife, Nancy, all through those Corfu years. But in the books, in Gerald Durrell's books, there's no mention of Nancy, and he seems very much the bachelor living with the family.
Yeah.
He solves this mystery.
Yeah. Jerry, he often said he took a great deal of poetic license, obviously, with the book, and he felt that the structure of it would make a better book if the family were all together in one unit and living in the same place. But obviously Larry was married. When they all first went out to Corfu, Larry was married, and he and Nancy went out first for a few weeks at all, and then encouraged the rest of the family to come out. And Nancy was a lovely, lovely woman. I never met her, but I knew their daughter very well, Penelope. And but Jerry adored Nancy. Nancy adored Jerry. And he had to explain to her why he was writing her out of the book. It wasn't very nice, but I guess she understood it. But of course, by the time Jerry had written the book, Larry and Nancy had long divorced. But it was a deliberate thing on Jerry's part to structure the book with just around the family.
I'm glad to hear that he liked her, because I thought, oh, maybe he didn't like her. And the worst thing to, like, instead of caricaturing somebody, you omit them entirely from the book. And what a masterful act of writerly revenge that would be.
No, I I never met her. I don't really know how she felt about it. But she was a wonderful artist, and she encouraged Jerry to sketch and to do things like that. And so, but yeah, good. That's a good question. It's a good point.
So, in preparation for this, I was rereading the books, and one of the most delightful things is that they still feel as fresh now as when I read them for the first time decades ago. I still laugh out loud. I am still absorbed in the sex between snails and the matchbox that's filled with the mama scorpions and all her little babies and Larry's many guests. And I wanted to think, for you, looking back, what do you think is the secret to the success and longevity of these books? Why do people still love it so much?
Oh. I think, unlike what Jerry had Larry saying at the beginning of Birds, Beasts, and Relatives, and in bad prose, I think Jerry just wrote like a dream. It was just so easy and pacey, but just fluid and beautifully written. Poetic, really. So he could write like anything. And interesting, the way he wrote was he would think a lot about it first. He often said people would ask, why are you gazing out the window? Why aren't you working? He said, well, I am working. It's all up in my head. I'm working here. And he would then finally sit down and put pen to paper, and this beautiful prose would just emerge. And so I think that's certainly one thing that has made the books, all of his books, stand the test of time. It's just that they're so beautifully written and just engaging when you read them. You mentioned humor, really a quirky sense of humor. People like that. People don't like being preached at and sad things happening all the time. They love to read things that make them laugh. And as you say, people laugh out loud when they read Jerry's books.
In fact, I remember, I think in the introduction to Garden of the Gods, he writes, it portrays a very important part of my life. And the thing which unfortunately a lot of children seem to lack, which is a truly happy and sunlit childhood. And I think when I was reading it, I didn't think of it that way. I was just reading for the fun of it. But looking back, it was truly a sunlit, childhood. Who else is getting history lessons while floating upside down in the blue waters of the bay?
Yes. And mathematics lessons about, how often do you have to feed a dormouse if you've got 3 crickets here and 5 locusts here. And anyway, he was just, that is exactly the way he learned. His classrooms were outdoors. And he once, he was often asked, actually, what would you, if you could give a child a gift, what would it be? And he said, well, it would be my magical childhood in Corfu. And, would that we could give children something like that. But at least we've got the books, and I hope children read them, and grown-ups. I think there are lots of lessons for grown-ups as well.
Did he ever count as to how many animals he had at what was peak Durrell?
I don't know, Sandip. That's a good question, actually. You could go through the books and
I keep counting, but I lose count every time because there's always a toad that's come in extra. And
there are probably lots that didn't make it into the book, as well.
And now, and the other thing that's fascinating is that other than dogs and things, so much of the book is taken up by animals that we don't necessarily think of as cute and cuddly. There are toads, the garlicky smelling toads, there are lots of bugs and scorpions and things. And that is a real gift, to be able to convey the world of bugs and beetles in a way that is so captivating to a reader, because it's much easier to write about pandas or wombats and things like that. No?
Well, I think you hit upon another important thing about Jerry and his later work, and that is that he had respect for and love for and a passion for all animals, the whole of the animal kingdom, whether they were, creepy crawly things that most people don't like, or whether they were also the big beautiful things like elephants and lions and such. And that's certainly the way Jerry's conservation work unfolded, is that if he saw a species that needed the kind of help that we could give it, breeding or studying it or whatever, he would go for it if it really needed it. So unlike other zoos, that when Jerry started his zoo, he didn't emphasize what you call the box office species. If there was something that needed help, the kind of help we could give it, we would have. He often called those the little brown jobs. So the more obscure, smaller creatures. And to this day, we could still call them the LBJs. And
I thought it stood for Lyndon Baines Johnson. I was wondering why the animals were called Lyndon Baines Johnson.
That's why.
And so right now, if you went to the zoo in Jersey, what are the LBJs we would be able to find?
Oh, lots of things, lots of amphibians in particular. You know, you mentioned toads, but certainly frogs we've got, because the terrible, you've heard about the terrible fungus that has been around now for 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years, that's been affecting global populations of amphibians. And we've lost a number of species already. But we are trying to save a lot of the very rare frogs of the world. So those are definitely LBJs. A number of small mammals. We've got the little mammals from Madagascar, like little mongoose. We've certainly got lots of lemurs, but lemurs are sort of nice. They're nice and cuddly. Various reptiles from the islands of Mauritius, the mascarenes. I have to say, we also have some big animals, because Jerry started the zoo back in '59, and one of our first biggest animals was a gorilla, Napongo, and we have kept gorillas ever since. So we've got gorillas and orangutans and something called the Andean bear, which is the only bear found in South America. There's a huge range up and down the Andes, but it's also a big animal. But those are the three big animals that we have, and all the rest are smaller. They're, you know, lemurs, lots of different birds. We've got waterfowl, but altogether it makes just a very pleasant experience because they've all got wonderful enclosures and very naturalistic. And many of them are breeding, and their offspring, you know, go back to the wild where they belong. That's one of, you know, a special thing that our zoo does. It's saving species from extinction.
And when Gerald Durrell was you know, how did he get into animals and nature? Because his mother obviously loved animals. The rest of the family, as it's portrayed in the book, wasn't that excited about it. But so where did he get it from?
Well,
and also the other thing, Lee, it's like, how did he, sitting in Corfu at that time with no Google around him, how did he know what all those insects even were?
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. And Lawrence was particularly keen on his education through books, and Lawrence would order books for him. I don't know if you remember the beginning of Birds, Beasts, and Relatives. A wonderful package arrived. It was the works of Jean-Henri Fabre, a French naturalist who was particularly interested in insects. And so Jerry would gather lots of books around. He did that all of his life. I mean, he read. He would have 5 or 6 books on the go at any one time. But I'm sure his love of animals, I think, like a lot of people, it was just innate. He was born with it. But I tell you, it was actually pretty much developed in India before he was 2 years old. You know, he was born in Jamshedpur, and he says he can remember certain things about being taken out by his ayah and looking at the little creatures in the bushes and on the ground, and he also said he would his first word was not mama or dada, but zoo, because he wanted to be taken to the local zoo. I don't think it exists anymore. Yeah. And so it really was India where this all came about. It became clear in India that he just had this great passion for animals.
And then what remains in Jamshed? Sorry, I was saying, what remains in Jamshedpur from there, Durrell's time there?
Oh, well, a lot, because it was, I actually visited a few years ago, because that was where Jerry was born. But the family is mostly remembered through Jerry's father. Jerry's father, Lawrence Durrell, was a wonderful civil engineer and worked for Tata for many, many years, and built so many of the buildings there, the administration offices, the hospital. He built the bungalow where Jerry was born. And so he is mostly remembered. And at the Tata, there's a wonderful museum where the history of the company is shown, and lots of images of Jerry's father, not Jerry, but Jerry's father. And it was wonderful. We were taken around to see all the buildings of, I guess, my father-in-law and what he had built there.
And but Gerald Durrell himself, did he come to India on an animal expedition ever?
Yeah, it wasn't so much an expedition, it was more of a fact-finding expedition. So he left India in 1927. He was born in 20, so he was only 2 when he left. And the first time he ever came back was in 1978. 78, so 50 odd years later. And he had heard about a wonderful creature called the Pygmy Hog. Now you know about the Pygmy Hog, Sandip, do you? From Assam, in the grasslands of Assam. It was thought to be extinct back in the 60s and in the 60s, but was rediscovered on a tea plantation in Assam. And Jerry, because of his Indian connection and because this was such a rare animal, Jerry wanted to see what he could do to help it. So he went to India in 1978 to see what could be done about the species. He had sent, I should say this, he had sent his right-hand man, who became the director of our zoo, Jeremy Mallinson, to India in, I think it was about 71, to find out about this rediscovery of this very rare creature, the Pygmy Hog. And it was found, and Jerry wanted to set up, he wanted to bring them to Jersey for breeding, but Jersey is very particular about bringing cloven-hoofed animals into the island of Jersey because of our wonderful cows, the famous Jersey cow.
Right.
And they just want to sort of closed door policy back then. So anyway, Jerry arranged to have some of these Pygmy hogs taken to Germany for breeding, and then we would be able to get the second generation. But that breeding program in Jersey did not work. And this is when Jerry was thinking very strongly about setting up breeding programs in the countries that the animals come from, which I think is essentially what we do now all over the world. And eventually, this is a long story, and I'll make it short. Eventually, it was in the 90s that we were able to set up a breeding station for the Pygmy Hog in Guwahati, and that has been hugely successful. And I visited there a couple of years ago. Just an amazing setup. And
so we can go there and see Pygmy hogs in Guwahati now.
Yes. Oh, yes, you can. And but we have been able to. The original population where it was rediscovered was in Manas National Park, but very small numbers. But through the breeding program, there have been set up 2 more populations in Assam, wild populations, in which we've used the captive bred hogs and released them into the wild, studied them and followed them. They've been breeding, so it's a great program.
But he never wrote about India, did he? In any of his books about this coming to the Pygmy Hog or anything like that?
He will have written about it in his 2 books about the zoo. I'm sure. I better check that. But he wrote one book called The Stationary Ark, but that was written before he went to India to see the Pygmy Hog. That was published in 76, I think it was. Then he wrote in 1988 the Ark's anniversary, when the zoo was 25 years old. And I'm sure he mentioned Pygmy Hog in there. But you're right, he never went on expedition to India himself to collect anything or collect Pygmy Hog. That's absolutely true.
And you yourself, you were studying animals in Madagascar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So tell us the story of how you ended up trapping Gerald Durrell.
The other way. I think it was the other way around. I think he trapped me.
I'm sure it was.
Well, because Jerry would go on lecture tours to America, and I was at an American university. So I returned from Madagascar in 1975 to finish writing up my dissertation. And it was in 77 that he was on a lecture tour in America and came through my university, which was Duke University, which had still has the most wonderful primate center for the lemurs of Madagascar. And I actually worked there occasionally, cleaning and feeding the animals, and I developed my interest in Madagascar because of that. Then I lived there for 2 years, came back to do my dissertation, and during that period, Gerald Durrell, the famous author, came through my university to see this primate center, to see the lemurs. And while I was in Madagascar, I'd been reading Gerald Durrell, and he was my hero. And it was just an amazing thing to be asked by my professors, would I like to come to dinner with a man called Gerald Durrell, a British author, and had I heard of him? And I said, I heard of him, he's my hero. And so I went to this dinner party with my professors, and that's just where it all started. Jerry and I hit it off. I came and visited him in Jersey, and then we were married. When was it? Just a couple of years later. But I visited Jersey in early '78, and I was just blown away. It was amazing. The zoo, it was all devoted to conservation, to animals, and it was just fantastic.
So you got a zoo as your trousseau, as part of your dowry. You got a zoo.
Dowry. Jerry very often said, I'm the only man in the world who's been married for my zoo. But shortly after we got married, we started doing a lot of television programs together. He was already very much an accomplished television presenter, but I then came on board and we did a lot of work together. We went back to Madagascar. Jerry had never been to Madagascar before, and I was able to had the privilege of taking Gerald Durrell to Madagascar and showing him lemurs and various tortoises and things that he'd never seen before. So that was great.
What kind of a travel companion is he? Does he forget about did he forget about the person he was with because the lemur or he's gotten interested in some little bird somewhere?
Yeah. Oh yeah. If we're walking through the forest, he was absolutely focused on what we were looking for. Yeah. No, he was a great travel companion that way. And anyway, we made television programs in Madagascar, Mauritius, of course, where we've done a lot of conservation work. We wrote a book together. He wrote the purple prose, as he said it, and I did the research, called The Amateur Naturalist. Don't know if you know about that. That was
no, I didn't.
And we made a television series about that. That took us all over the world, not to India, unfortunately. And then we did a program about natural history of the Soviet Union. So it was not Russia at the time, but still the old Soviet Union. And that was mid '80s, so that was fun.
I'm going to invite people who are watching to send in questions that they might have to the Durrell about Gerald Durrell and his books. But I just wanted to ask you, Durrell. Well, number one, people always say you shouldn't even meet your heroes, especially ones you've grown up reading and idolizing. Forget marry them. So hats off to you for your guts in doing that. And I read somewhere in an interview, and I wanted to know if it's true. Did he once give you spiders as an anniversary gift?
Oh yes. That was our 10th anniversary, so that was an important milestone. And it was 4 tarantulas, not just any old spiders, but just wonderful. So there was obviously a Mexican red knee. There was, I can't even remember the names of them now, but they were, big spiders like that. And I remember when we would go off traveling, we had a flat in the zoo itself. And if we had to go off traveling, I asked his secretary if she would please look after my spiders, feed the spiders. She wasn't too happy about that. Anyway, I thought that was a great present. I thought they were wonderful.
One of the things when you're reading about these spiders and things, it's also what's wonderful in reading the book is how clear and unsentimental he is about the fact that animals eat other animals. So, he's getting minced mice or whatever for his owl, Ulysses, because owls need. Or I remember a scene where Leslie is shooting all these sparrows because they need to feed the owl, and they come raining down on the woman who's trying to start the local chapter of the SPCA and getting bloody sparrows raining on her. But he seemed to be perfectly at peace with the fact that that here he is the animal lover, and his brother goes around shooting all kinds of animals.
Well, remember how long ago this was? It was 80 years ago. And, shooting and hunting and things were, a lot of people did that. But Jerry was, he was not a vegetarian at all. He certainly ate meat. And I just think he looked at the world, as a sort of natural ecosystem. And you've got the predators and the prey and the whole food web. And he just was very comfortable with that. And that was how his animals had to be fed. And so he carried on like that. Yeah. But I don't think that didn't diminish his love for and passion for animals at all, if he felt he had to feed one to another, if you see what I mean.
So we have a question from Devnita, who says, would love to know whether the great man talked to his animals like we normal animal lovers do, or did he have a special and more effective non-verbal communication methods? And this is a perfect question for you, since your research was in animal communication.
Well, the answer is yes. Yes, he certainly did talk to his animals. I mean, if we would go around the zoo or go around to we visited a lot of other zoos together. And he always had a kind word to say, whatever creature he came up to. And a lot of people, would bring animals to him. And but it was, I couldn't really say it was talking to in any different way from the way we talk to our dog or our cat, I have to say. But people with an affinity for animals, I think the animals themselves feel that. So any dog, any cat would always come up to Jerry. Yeah, he was not afraid of animals, and he sort of included them in his circle, if you know what I mean. Thank you for that. That's good.
So we have another question saying from Ankita saying, one of my favorite characters was Ursula. Is Ursula a real person, and did Lee ever meet her?
Yeah. Ursula was a real person, and I think Jerry writes about her perhaps more eccentrically than she was, but she was sort of a good egg, Ursula, and I certainly never met her. I think that was quite some time. He was fairly young when he met Ursula, if I'm remembering that correctly. But yeah, she made for a good character in the stories. Whatever happened to her, I certainly don't know. But I mean, most of Jerry's characters were real characters, unless you go into the actual novels like Rosie Is My Relative or The Mockery Bird or something like that. But he mercilessly used other people in his books. Yes.
We have another question. The story called the Jury, was it true? Did Mr. Durrell really encounter these ghosts?
I don't think so. No. No. I'll tell you though, a sort of a ghost story. It's not that he didn't believe in ghosts. I think he probably did, and he had a lot of books on ghosts and supernatural and all of that. And when after they left India, from age sort of 3 to 10, they were in Bournemouth mostly, and they were in about 3 different houses. But in one house, the family, a big dog called Prince, I think it was, went into one of the rooms of the houses, and his hackles rose, and he started staring at something. And Jerry himself then followed the dog. Jerry was only about 3 or 4 or something. Followed the dog in, and he saw his father sitting in a chair. And he swears that's absolutely true.
Wow.
And then father just disappeared, but he swears he remembers that. So whether the jury, harked back to something like that, I don't know.
A friend of mine wrote an essay a long time ago saying, it's a Vietnamese friend, and when he went to America, he wrote an essay called "Do Ghosts?" My grandmother asks, "Do ghosts cross the ocean?" Because she left behind her husband in Vietnam, who died in Vietnam. Right. And I guess this is this might well be the answer to that.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about, in terms of, right now we watch things like Animal Planet, David Attenborough's Animal Planet, and when you read Gerald Durrell's books, you think that, wow, this is like watching Animal Planet before there was Animal Planet. There's this detail of this ant lion larvae are constructing a sand trap, or these spiders are laying eggs, or the snails are shooting love darts at each other. And this is sort of, in those ways, do you think Gerald Durrell was really ahead of his time? Because he was writing about these things which we think nobody would be interested in unless, shot in that kind of high definition photography of Animal Planet.
Mm-hmm. I think Jerry was very definitely ahead of his time, in that sense that you're describing, because his works are so graphic and visual, and you can just get a sense almost of seeing something just as much as from a beautiful natural history film. But Jerry was certainly ahead of his time, because he was talking about conservation and what human beings are doing to the planet back in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. And very few people were on about that at the time. And the early natural history films, never talked about the problems. And Jerry certainly did talk about the problems way back when. I think he was in Australia in the early 60s and was talking about the farmers poisoning birds of prey because they thought they were getting their sheep, and he was talking about pesticides and back then as well, and just the loss of habitats and forests. I mean, that's one reason he set up his own zoo, was that in all the places that he had been collecting animals for other zoos, he would go back to them the next year or 2 years later, Cameroon's in particular, and find that where he knew there had been lots of certain kinds of animals, the forests had gone, the animals had gone, and he was just witnessing firsthand habitat destruction. And he said, well, zoos aren't doing anything about this. They're part of the problem. They're taking animals out of the wild and incarcerating them. Well, why? I'm going to have a zoo that will be completely different. It will be devoted to saving species. And that's exactly what he did. So he was really ahead of his time in the zoo world, and is a real pioneer, in fact, in the zoo world.
I know you have a few, speaking of seeing things, you have a few images of Gerald Durrell in his time. And I wanted to see if our folks here were ready with those images, so we could show these images if they are available. Can we do that now? Or, well, we'll see. We'll let them get ready with that. But yeah, that's the technological stuff. But in line of what you were just saying, Lee, I just recently read about this new species of whale, Rice's whale, that had been found somewhere, which they didn't know existed. But as soon as it's been found, it's also been described as critically endangered. Mm-hmm. So as a naturalist, when you look around the world, it just seems to be bad news all the time. How do you keep going? Where do you find the hope?
I think I agree, one can become very sort of suicidal about looking at the whole planet as a whole and what's happening, and just such massive, huge problems that individual people can't solve. But then you also look at the stories of conservation successes, and okay, they are just one species here, one species, a forest here, a lake here, and if you could just add all of those up, it would make for a great deal of optimism. Now, whether we'll actually, make it one day and really turn around the way the planet's going, I don't know. But you've got
seeing some of.
to try. You've got to try, Sandip. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
Yes.
Anyway, I see we've got pictures up now.
We've got some slides. If you could just tell us a little bit about what we're seeing.
Okay, so right now, shall I start now?
Yeah, just start with what we're seeing.
That is the wonderful Theodore Stefaniedes, who was such an important character to Jerry. Theodore was a real scientist and he was a polymath, really. And he taught Jerry the value of science and how to observe. And as well as he loved to sketch, he loved to write little poems. And Jerry always did that as well. So Theodore, who was a real mentor, and for Larry as well. Theodore appears in Lawrence's book about Corfu.
Yeah, he's very much a part of Prospero Cell. In fact, Jerry isn't in that book. There's a little bit of Leslie in there, I think, but Theodore. And before that, I think we saw the whole family standing on the balcony or something like that.
Yeah, that was, if you remember in the books, the middle villa was called the Daffodil Yellow Villa, and that was where that photograph was taken. And that's the only villa that is still pretty much as it was, although it's owned by a private family and nobody can visit it. But the first villa, Strawberry Pink Villa, has since been knocked down. And the last villa, very sadly, very unfortunately, is about
the Snow White Villa.
Snow White Villa is about to fall down because nobody's looking after it, and the family won't sell it. I've already inquired about that. That's a very famous shot. Do you see the little island?
Yeah, the little island in the background. And I think that was
Mouse Island, it's called. And Jerry and Margaret used to swim out to Mouse Island every morning, early in the morning. And in fact, Jerry's ashes are scattered around Mouse Island. I put them there some years after he passed away. That's the famous. That's Spiros Halakiopoulos. Oops, we're going. Can we go slower?
Yeah, can we go back to the Spiros picture? Spiros of Golly's Mrs. Durrell, you makes me scarce.
That's my house now.
Which is very daffodil yellowish too.
It is, isn't it? And that's Father Durrell's little booklet saying the various work that he had done for the Tata Company. And that's the bungalow that he built for workers, and including himself for Tata. And that's where Jerry was born. And I visited that in 2017, and it's still there. It still looks just like that. Now that is when Jerry came back to India in 1978. I don't know where that is, except I think it probably must be in Assam, because he remembered up to Assam to see the Pygmy Hogs, and a very few pictures of that trip.
And that's the Pygmy Hog.
That is the little Pygmy Hog. I think they're just adorable.
You could have a Pygmy Hog plushie.
Yes, you could. That's a little Pygmy Hog family, and that's the breeding station at Guwahati. Oh. And it's really, really wonderful. There's a baby. You see how they're really tiny they are. And the next one will be. And that is taking some of the ones we've bred back to the release, to 3 different release sites. And on the left is a man called Parag Dekar, who is a wonderful chap who's worked for us for many years, veterinarian, and now leading the program. And that's Jerry in Corfu with the taxi driver who was so much part of the family, Spiros Halakiopoulos, on a beach in the north of the island. And you see Spiros' famous car dog there on the beach there, and I visit that beach every year. And now that is the Snow White Villa, the one that's now falling down, which is just really so sad. But I do like my villa that I've got now, and that's the family on the balcony at the Daffodil Yellow Villa. You see Mother on the right, there's Janet. Lawrence is posed, draped like an artist along the balustrade. And that's Nancy, his wife, we mentioned earlier.
Oh, the missing Nancy.
And the other lady was Margaret. And again, that's Jerry on a wall overlooking Mouse Island, where his and Margaret's ashes are scattered on Mouse Island as well.
I believe today is, in fact, Gerald Durrell's death anniversary.
Yes, it is. Yes, he died exactly 26 years ago today, 30th of January.
So in many ways, well, I wanted you to leave us with, an encounter, an anecdote of something that summed up Gerald Durrell for you, whether it was his sense of humor, the one you knew.
Well, now you've sprung that on me, Sandy. I don't know. I haven't thought about that really. I guess I don't know. A story. I remember arriving in Mauritius, where Mauritius was the land of the dodo, where the extinct bird came from, and Jerry chose the dodo for the symbol of his work, and saying that he didn't want extinction to happen to the other animals he was looking after. And the day that we arrived in Mauritius, when I first arrived, he came down the stairs of the plane and he knelt down and he kissed the ground. And he said, "Here I am in the land of the dodo. And I'm not letting extinction happen on my watch," was what he meant. So he really was a very humble man, very passionate man. And I think, we all miss him. But his books are still here for us all to read.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you joined us here. We had one last question from Simran, who said, "Is it easy to gain an animal's trust?" You said people who have an affinity for animals. Is this a gift or not? I don't know the answer to that, but whatever it is, Gerald Durrell certainly had it, whether it was a talent or a gift or something.
He did indeed. He had so much of it. You're absolutely right. Anyway, thank you very much for having me on this virtually, and I hope to see you all in India next year.
Please do come. So if you could raise, I don't know, how do you say cheers in Greek? So if you could raise a toast to Gerald Durrell, wherever he is. Thank you.
Yamas.
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 Thank you, Lee Durrell. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great pleasure.
And see you in a year, I hope.
I hope so.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.